Hello everyone. Welcome to the October Faculty Research Seminar. Nathan Gardner, and I'm the student representative for the Faculty Research Committee. Today we're going to be talking about victims and witnesses of crimes, and today we're going to follow the same format. There'll be 3 presentations, and then following the presentations, we'll have the speakers come back up, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Just a reminder for everyone to please turn off their mobile phones. Our first presenter today is Tim Hope, and he's a professor of criminology at the University of Salford. And today he's going to be talking about issues and methods related to the social epidemiology of crime victims.
Just a minute. Okay, I'm going to talk about some research or a program or a continuation of a number of studies going back nearly 20 years, over a period of 20 years that I've conducted on trying to understand various aspects of the social distribution of crime victimization. There is a theme, which I hope will come through as I go through this, and the other common denominator is that all the empirical work is based on the British Crime Survey, secondary analysis of the British Crime Survey. But I hope you'll agree with me or appreciate that this is what's as important as the data is the approach and the model one takes to that data. So this presentation is, in a way, a kind of evolution of a model of explanation of what produces the particular characteristics of the distribution of crime victimization. Now, this is the distribution of crime victimization, which is essentially similar for all survey-based data, self-report crime victimization, survey-based data for most kinds of crime victimization which are asked about, which are measured in these kinds of sample surveys, invariably, I would argue, produce this distribution. Now, for those in the public health business, this may actually be quite a familiar distribution, sometimes known as a negative binomial distribution. It has some peculiarities though, and it is a puzzle. It doesn't look like a puzzle, but it does contain some considerable puzzles. And it has 2 things together that make up this distribution. It is what, of course, is called over-dispersed, which technically means that the variance, the variation amongst the sample is greater than the mean. And that's produced, so it has 2 characteristics to do with one or the other of its the tails of the distribution. It is, first of all, zero inflated. So there are far more zeros than one would expect, I suppose. Certainly it looks nothing like a normal distribution. So there are far more zeros. So there's the phenomenon of zero inflation. Why it is that large proportions of the population don't seem to count, literally as it were, in the phenomena that we're measuring. On the other hand, small proportions of the population count disproportionately, count a tremendous amount. So it has zero inflation and then a very long, attenuated right-hand tail. Now those 2 things, where most of the population don't suffer the thing, and a small, or in some ways minuscule proportion of the population suffer most of it, is a problem. Now, I think it's probably similar to many other public health type phenomena, which is interesting. And it's interesting and important that it is similar to many other public health type phenomena, because it helps, and this is one of my, I suppose, one of the subtexts of what I wanted to say, is that it helps to bring crime victimization as a phenomena back into a realm of more general kinds of explanations, perhaps even a more public health type of approach than certainly a criminal justice population. So, for all these kinds of crimes, measured in the British Crime Survey, and it doesn't really change from one year to the next, we have a very large proportion who are non-victims, but of the victims, we also have sizable and increasingly substantial proportions of the population that are multiple victims. Sometimes, and I want to suggest probably erroneously called repeat victims. Now, I mean, aside from all the notorious problems of measuring the domestic violence accurately, and I have no wish to defend the British Crime Survey as a measure of domestic violence or as the perfect measure of capturing all domestic violence. Nevertheless, this was from a study by Walby and Allen which attempted to use this method as best as it possibly could to get at, again, a similar distribution. And again, we have this bipolar issue, even more so, even more extreme. It would seem that it would seem, at least from this data, that there are kind of two classes. There are those who are non-victims, but then of victims are victimized frequently. Now, clearly we can explain that, and that's not in a sense what I want to do. But what I want to do is to argue really that these two phenomena are not separate phenomena. Now, most of policy in recent years has been concerned with trying to target and identify the small group in the population who suffer the most crime victimization. Because obviously you get a bigger bang for your prevention or protective buck. If only you can find the people who are responsible or the people who are excessively victimized from this issue, you can then, having found them, you can then deliver prevention in an efficient way to them. And that's been the big goal of prevention of crime victimization, and I dare say obviously in public health context too, as it indeed borrows that view from public health. And forgive me for sort of telling you what you know, what's sort of public health 101, but this kind of thinking is less thought through in criminal justice applications. But of course, this policy of targeting the high risk, high frequency stands against and is often claimed as an argument against general population-wide prevention policies. This is taken literally, as though the rest of the population don't count, literally don't count. Well, what I want to suggest is actually we need both, and the rest of the whole population counts all the time. Okay. One of the things over the last 20 years myself and colleagues have done is to try and look at the area, to try and model from the British Crime Survey the effect of neighbourhood, the effect of area, the contextual effect of area. British Crime Survey, like most population surveys, is a survey of individuals, sampled individuals, but making use of the particular sample design of the British Crime Survey, it's a multi-stage clustered sample, which means at its lowest level, it interviews a cluster of people living in geographic proximity. So we kind of take those to be pseudo-neighbourhoods, or did take those to be pseudo-neighbourhoods. Now, if you aggregate those clusters, and then if you if you rank them and aggregate them again into deciles, so this is all aggregation, and calculate two rates. One, prevalence, that's the proportion of victims in the population, and incidence, which is the number of victimizations per capita. Across those groups, we get this disparity, or we got this disparity. So at the top 10%, particularly from the the 10% areas with the highest crime rates, have disproportionately high crime rates relative to what might be expected in terms of the proportion of victims. So that has been taken to indicate the existence of this target group, this small proportion of repeat victims who happen to live in high crime neighborhoods. So there's a correlation, the concentration of victimization on individuals with the concentration of victimization in the communities, which has also intrigued, puzzled, and I think actually misled most analysts and policymakers, because not only is this an argument for targeting those individuals, but it was seen as a great plus that if those high-risk individuals actually lived in high-risk areas, if you targeted the high-risk areas, you'd then automatically target the high-risk individuals. So that seemed like a great attraction for policymakers. This line here is the same as this one. It's just exactly the same. That's if you plotted crime itself across areas. This is if you plotted the crime rates ranking areas not by, in this case, by their crime rates, but by their level of social deprivation, socioeconomic deprivation. And this is, so these are these two distributions superimposed one on the other, and simply to serve the same heuristic purpose that you could as efficiently target the high crime areas, not on their crime rates, but on their level of social deprivation. So one argument, and I won't go into this because it's a sort of kind of, well, anyway. One argument is that crime causes crime. High vulnerable individuals, repeat victims, cause the crime rates in high crime areas, as we saw earlier in that. This is to say, well, you don't even need to know that because, as many other theories suggest, social conditions, deprivation cause high crime areas just as much. So those are the classic kind of polarity of, explanation. If, though, the argument that if we concentrated on finding the high crime individuals, the high at risk individuals, and did something with them, then the crime rate would come down, then we should expect the crime rate to be responsive to the proportion, to the frequency with which people are victimized, which is called the, which we call, or have called in some of our work, the concentration, the rate of concentration, the number of crimes per victim, number of victimizations per victim, as opposed to prevalence, the number of victims in the population, which together are a multiplicative incidence. The crime rate, the number of crimes per capita population, is clearly a simple multiplicative product of these two. Which seemed, and so this was the promising thing, but whether or not policy actually ever managed to target these repeat victims, demonstrably actually we've seen from the British Crime Survey, and this is extrapolated, we saw a peak in the early 90s and then a dramatic decline to the mid to late 2000s. It's probably beginning to go up again, but that's another story. But actually what this shows is that the crime rate is driven far more by prevalence than it is by the rate of concentration, which of course is not surprising given that the few number of people, the people producing this are very few indeed. But nevertheless, often policy goes off on gets caught up in something that they don't kind of really think through and get carried away with the promise of doing things and in the end never do. So this is just, again, an indexed, this makes the same point, that this is the prevalence of all victims. These are all indexed. This is the prevalence of one-off victims, and the majority of victims are still one-off victims. And this is the change in the rate of repeat victims. And I mean, the inference is that victimization is just still, the population prevalence is still driven largely by low-level victimization. Victimization just affects people rarely or once in the recall period. This is 12-month recall period. And only when there's an exceptional, and I'm not saying anything about the reliability of this data, but only when there's an exceptional change in the prevalence of repeat victims does it seem to lift the general prevalence rate above the trend of single victims, but again, only marginally. And the issue there is probably because just a fundamental dependency that you can't be a repeat victim without first being a victim. So there's a proportionate and kind of fixed relationship between the prevalence of victimization generally and the prevalence of then the frequency of repeat victimization. So as overall prevalence goes down, there are just fewer victims available to be, from which to select, as it were, repeat victims. A simple point, but nevertheless one that seemed to have missed policymakers in their enthusiasm for crime prevention projects over coinciding with New Labour. This is something that my colleagues did many years ago, 20 years ago now, which is a puzzle and an intriguing issue, and I want to sort of take this up now. This is about the prevalence, that's the proportion of victims in the population. This is the same way of ranking using these pseudo-neighbourhoods and ranking them together. This is the actual observed rate from this data going up in that fairly regular fashion we saw before. And this is what would be expected to be the crime rate given the number of observations. This has been taken again, this was taken again to suggest that the gap is due to there being, amongst victims, there being this small number of repeat victims who are excessively contributing. This is, if crime within each of these areas, was distributed randomly, proportionate to the prevalence, it would be like that. Instead it's like that, so there are some proportion, again this shows the point, there's some proportion that are victimised more frequently. That's one inference, and that's been the most common inference. Obviously, driven by this idea of finding these repeat victims and, and getting greater prevention efficiency and something for the police to do that might appear to be effective and so on and so on. The other way of looking at this, though, is to say that actually, well, if there aren't as many victims as you'd expect there to be, and particularly in higher crime areas, there are people who are not getting their fair share of being victimised. They're getting off being victimised. They're not being victimised. Now, I mean, there again, and I'm not in a position to enter into any explanation of that. I mean, it could be that they are the people who are doing the victimising of people who unfortunately get it. Or it could be that the victim and offender populations within deprived areas are sort of coterminous, and that the rest of the population isn't touched by them at all. It could be a lot of those different explanations, and that's an avenue, I think, that's worth empirical research, and one that hasn't really been followed. So there's a problem. Okay, the prevalent explanation for crime victimization dominating our world has been, over the last 20, 30 years, has been the idea that people become victimized the more they are exposed to risk. And that risk, obviously, because victimization is not something you just catch, but you have to be actively encounter a carrier, if you like, a motivated active offender. So it's a product of exposure to different social environments containing motivated active offenders. So individuals, therefore, vary in their exposure to risk environments, and these are sometimes called routine activity or lifestyle theories, because the variables that influence exposure are to do with people's lifestyles, where they live, where they go, where they travel, their age, their gender, which makes them differentially vulnerable or differentially available, if you like, if I can use that in a non-pejorative sense. So proximity to crime, exposure to crime, coincidental lifestyles, the attractiveness of their property and their guardianship. So risk is incremental and cumulative under this. So the more exposure you have, the more likely you are to be victimized. And the problem with that kind of explanation is, where does it end? What limits it? In a paper, well, it's the same paper, one was in French and one was in English, so it's one paper. A few years ago, we developed an alternative that takes the zero end of the spectrum as the explanation. So in this case, rather than exposure, and the problems of what limits it, this says, well, the normal condition is that victimization doesn't happen. It's the zeros. So there's a general, and we found this from a panel study, there was a general tendency for people to cease being victims over time. And only short-run frequent victims we found were long-run persistent victims. So we ventured another explanation, one based on vulnerability, or defining vulnerability not as excessive exposure to risk, but inability or powerlessness to avoid exposure. Most of the time, most of us lead lifestyles and avoid risk if we can help it. If we can afford it, we move to safe neighbourhoods. If we can afford it, we travel in cars rather than on public transport. And then we get older and we get, we derive more pleasure from a bottle of wine at home than going downtown on a Friday night and getting bladdered. But those who remain, and this is particularly so, and this I think helps to relate the problem of explaining the repeat victimization in interpersonal violence, and especially domestic violence, from victimization in other contexts. You know, there's never really been an easy way of integrating these two approaches. But like victimization, as I've shown, excessive victimization in a high crime neighborhood or in an abusive relationship, we might say, and this is a simple kind of explanation, that's due to an inability to be able to get out, an inability to be protected by moving away from an abusive neighborhood or relationship. Of course, if you change that relationship, change the perpetrator, change the neighborhood, and so on, that might do the trick as well. But in the interim, as that evidently doesn't happen very often, so only those who can't get out are stuck. And so they're just stuck and continually available, as it were, to the offender to victimize them. So anyway, this is a sort of general explanation then. So it might be then that the distribution of victimization is not one distribution, but two. And it may well then be a product of two processes, exposure and immunity. So let's say at any one time, an individual, each of us has a position on each of these distributions. We have a probability of not becoming a victim, and we have a probability of becoming a victim. Now that may be more useful to think, if both of those probabilities are socially structured, then it might be that one is simply not the opposite of the other. They may have a degree of independence. So that's my working hypothesis. I've done, and then recently been doing some data exploration, really. I haven't really got time to describe the method. To look at this to try and identify this heterogeneity within the distribution of crime victimization. And if we rewrite the distribution into two groups, and if you just have two groups, it breaks down very neatly in terms of these probability of membership of a non-victimization class and probability of membership of a victimization class. I mean, this is not really saying much statistically. It's just rewriting it, but it does seem to rewrite it this is the actual distribution, and to rewrite it in a way that's consistent with this model of... So I found that helpful. We then went on with this analysis to, and this is one of our analysis, this analysis sorts out in terms of frequency of victimization and different types of victimization within the general household property crime, different groups, different probability groups, have similar patterns of frequency and type of victimization. And we find a predominantly non-victim group, 80% of the population, bumping along the bottom here, and we find a chronic group, which in this maximum solution is only 0.3% of the population. So if we were really wanting to target the real multiple repeat victims, we'd have to look not only for a needle in the haystack, but we have to look at the point of the needle in the haystack to find them. But nevertheless, these two groups don't overlap at all in their probabilities. So I think that confirms the bipolar distribution, nature of this distribution. And intermediate groups, which comprise, sort of but do overlap. Sometimes they have, on one type of offence, quite a large frequency of victimisation, and other times not. Working out the proportion of the population in each of these classes with that gives us a very interesting and different take on the implications of looking at the distribution in this way. Yes, all right, there's a huge disproportionality in the chronic victims case. So 0.3% of the 0.03% of the population is responsible for getting off 7% of the crime victimisation. That's hugely disproportionate, but there's still a tiny bunch. And the 80% of people, most of us, most of the time, who aren't victims, maybe at random and so on, we still nevertheless account, all of the rest of us account for just under a quarter of all the crime victimisation that occurs. So there's still something that happens to us. And that leaves then, the intermediate groups who between them seem to eat up a very large proportion of the population, and particularly, these groups that do the same. Now, this is just by way of illustration, and it isn't really, we haven't done any further analysis to explain who these people are, where they live, which would be a clue to anything. But I think it opens up this field, really, again, and a kind of different way of looking at crime victimisation. And you see that, and you see that. That's something I produced, again, the area deprivation, the deciles. It's a terrible graph. I couldn't really do graphs then. That's crime, the blue one. The red is a rate of affluence, and the green is the one we saw earlier, deprivation, like that. So that. Intriguing, is it not? Thank you.
I'm sort of a bit of an interloper because I don't actually think I'm specifically talking about victimisation or distribution of victimisation, but I was drafted in as super sub, but I'm not ginger enough to be the proper super sub. So, in terms of my talk, what I'm going to talk about is drug treatment practitioners' perceptions of methadone diversion. And I think there are actually some links in with victimisation, particularly some of the stuff that Tim was just saying about sort of pockets and focuses around sort of the distribution, because I think a lot of the people involved with this process are likely to be individuals who might be in some of those pockets, some of those clusters, and they're probably the people who are going to be the individuals who are repeat victims. And there's a lot of links in with drug users in terms of that link into social deprivation, and therefore the link into crime victimisation, and also perpetrators of crime in this group as well. Some basic background. International research has really sort of backed up the role of methadone in producing positive individual outcomes from a harm reduction point of view. There's obviously quite a lot of debate at the moment in the UK about whether it's producing the right societal sort of outcomes, but on individual outcomes like reducing mortality, reducing morbidity, on a range of health issues, there's quite a lot of evidence supporting it. It's not universal, but there is quite a lot of evidence. And it is still the main drug for opiate substitution in the UK and in a lot of countries across the world. Buprenorphine, Subutex tends to be used more in some other areas. But there have and continue to be quite a lot of concerns over diversion and the potential links to overdose, although again, there's a bit of debate about whether actually it's protective towards overdose or from street drugs, but then the links in with methadone actually being a cause of an increased overdose itself. Study was around Merseyside, and part of that was because, as we come on to the rationale in a second, we sort of got the real prompt from looking at data from across Merseyside to do this piece of work. But also, one of the advantages of Merseyside, not least just because we're here, so that's always handy, but is the fact that it's got a really well-established treatment system with a very sort of traditionally harm reduction focus. And that means that you have, in some areas particularly, quite high levels of long-term methadone-maintained individuals, which means that you have a potential market for methadone already there. So the rationale was based on 4 things particularly. We were seeing a substantial number of drug users being arrested who were then reporting illicit methadone use at the point of arrest. So that really prompted us to have a look at it a little bit further. There's not a massive amount of recent UK research into methadone diversion. There's a fair bit done sort of 10, 15 years ago, and none in this geography particularly. And there's been quite a lot of changes to the treatment system. In some ways it's got stricter, in other ways some areas have gone down a different route and had more flexibility about how they prescribe. So the whole sort of treatment system has changed, so to not have looked at it for that long time is a bit remiss. And what we found actually was that practitioners' views around methadone diversion essentially hadn't been collected pretty much by anybody, so there's a gap in terms of the literature. And also, as I said, this renewed focus on recovery in the UK at the moment really raises some additional questions about the widespread use of methadone. It has already raised some additional questions. You know, the philosophical debate about whether it should raise those questions, I'll leave for another time. So, very quickly, methodology-wise, we did semi-structured interviews with quite a large number of people, and I'd probably focus on the sort of semi rather than the structured angle of that, because we really did leave the practitioners to sort of tell us in a very broad perspective what they thought about methadone diversion. We just really sort of prompted them around the nature of it and the reasons why they thought it was happening. We had 19 doctors working generally within specialist drug treatment agencies, 76 key workers and 25 community pharmacists. We had a pretty good variety of types of sites. Even though that sort of looks like there's only 3 different types, the community drug teams have very different philosophies across Merseyside, so you don't really have the same philosophy in each of those teams. And the same thing goes for the criminal justice teams in the fact that their scope and their size, the number of people, is quite different. And we did see 2 doctors in their surgeries who were actually also working within specialist treatment, but actually we saw them within their surgeries. And we got a good mix with the pharmacies as well, a mixture of national, regional and local companies, because obviously policies are going to be determined by the overarching policy of an organisation and how that's actually implemented. And that maybe some of the pharmacies might be more embedded in the local community and with their local sort of population than others. In terms of the extent of methadone diversion, what we found is that essentially nobody knew how much it was happening. So it was really difficult to get any sort of consensus from practitioners. Some of them thought it was big, some of them thought it was small, some of them thought it had got better, some of them thought it had got worse. So there was a real variety. So practitioners really didn't have much of a consensus. And the key workers did say that clients would report to them that they'd used illicit methadone, but that generally, obviously, probably the sort of fear element would mean that they'd have to rely on second-hand or anecdotal information about whether actually people had been diverting their methadone. And I suppose the sort of uncertainty is quite well summed up by the last couple of sentences here. Most people keep their prescribed amount, but actually it's got to come from somewhere, so that's a bit of a disconnect there. So the practitioners were aware that they didn't really have a clear idea. And I think the potential there for conflict with clients needs to be highlighted as well, that there's no clarity, so how do you raise it with a client if you think that that's going on, all that sort of stuff. Really, to the sort of core of it, there were 3 suggested patterns around the nature of the diversion. The most commonly suggested one was around financial, And this is the one that's mostly brought up in the literature that's been previously sort of published. And it was using the selling of methadone, the providing of methadone to others to get money to buy illicit drugs or for day-to-day items, whatever they may be. The interesting bit was the second one, really. There was a strong feeling that there was quite a lot of altruism going on in the fact that it was friends and family who were being given the methadone. There was no money changing hands, and it was just sort of on a case-by-case basis, or somebody needed help, so I sorted them out. And the last bit, I suppose, possibly the most worrying would be around the coerced element. There was a strong feeling that there was an element of vulnerable clients being coerced into giving up the methadone by other users. And again, I think that links in with the victimisation angle as well. These people are probably within that group of people who are highly likely to be victims. One thing that was really sort of strongly put forward was that there isn't a large commercial market. There's nobody with a bucket of methadone somewhere and somebody turns up and asks them for some and they get a ladle out. And, you know, it's not like rum. They did feel that it was really small amounts diverted each time, and it was just on a, oh, I've got a bit left, so I'll give it to them. And somebody would do without their methadone in order to sort somebody else out. The need, I think, is a fairly obvious point, but the four main reasons why the need arose were clients missing pickups, clients feeling that dosage was inadequate, and this is from the practitioner's point of view. And interestingly, in other work we've done looking at the clients didn't really report inadequate dose as a main reason for them using diverted methadone. So actually there's a real disconnect between the practitioner's views and the client's views here. They did feel there was a population who were trying to avoid engaging in treatment. Mothers were the obvious one that's always put forward. I think that's fairly well documented in the literature. Primarily, it was just when other drugs aren't available. One of the overwhelming feelings that did come back from clients and also from the practitioners is there was a sort of a bit of a fatalistic view that methadone was just used as a bit of a backup to when they couldn't actually obtain the drugs that they actually wanted. We asked them about how they responded to diversion, and they came up with 4 or 5 key things. Clarification around objectives and conditions of treatment was the main one. And everybody said that upon treatment entry, they went through the safety issues, the issues around supervised consumption and all that sort of stuff with the clients. Treatment contracts weren't universal, so a lot of clients didn't have any sort of treatment contracts. And there were reports of regular reiteration of terms and conditions, but I suppose there is an element of self-report in this. If you're asked, do you do the thing that you're meant to do, by somebody who's probably not going to be able to independently verify that, you're probably going to go yes. So we do feel that possibly some of the reports of regular reiteration might not have been happening quite as much as we think. The pharmacists did play no role in discussing treatment objectives at all. They said they left everything to the prescriber, and I'll come back to that in a little bit because I think there's a bit of a gap there about the role of pharmacists. One of the key things in literature is that the key way that people can actually manage to obtain methadone is by playing practitioners off against each other, and that was obviously something that the practitioners were aware of in this case. And they felt that doctor and key worker communication was actually pretty regular and of a good quality, and there was a good exchange of information, and that the doctors did benefit from the greater insight that the key workers had from their more consistent interaction with the clients. But there was a feeling that contact tended to be rushed about around the sort of, sorry, is that 10 minutes gone or 10 minutes left? Thank you. And it tends to be around clinics. So you have just before clinics, just after clinics, and you get a few minutes. It's like, oh, they said this the other day, they said that the other day, or, you know, Johnny, who knows him, said this the other day, and all that sort of stuff. So there wasn't actually necessarily the consistency, but when it did happen, they felt it was good quality. Key workers were the conduit to pharmacists and vice versa. The doctors didn't have any contact with pharmacists at all. And they did feel that this communication between the key workers and the pharmacists was of good quality, but tended to happen when something happened. So it would be, oh, you know, they've not turned up. There didn't seem to be any sort of, oh, he looked good today, or something seems to be odd. There was no sort of ad hoc, there was no ongoing communication. It tended to be by exception rather than to just say on a regular basis. So I think there's a real need to maybe build that into something more robust, and particularly when the key workers felt that pharmacists were a really important source of information, but then actually didn't seem to use that source very often. So again, there's a bit of a contrast. The obvious point is prescription collection. That's the obvious point of diversion. And one of the main findings was that there was a real inconsistency in the need for ID at pharmacies. So quite often people would be asked first time they come in to show their ID, and that would be it. And that's fine if you've always got the same pharmacist in. But obviously you get local pharmacists coming in and actually working in the pharmacy. We sort of thought about that potential point of conflict again, about somebody who never has to bring ID, and then a locum comes in and goes, oh, I'd like to see your ID. And then they haven't got any with them, and there's a real point about treatment engagement and sort of disincentivising the clients there. But I think generally it raises some questions about the potential for diversion and methadone going to individuals who actually it isn't for. Supervised consumption was a real sort of, as it is anyway, was a real point of contention with everybody. Everybody felt that it was the best way that you could actually prevent diversion. But there was a real issue with the sort of punitive and degrading aspect of it. The degrading aspect particularly because a lot of feedback from the stakeholders was that they felt that even though they knew that most pharmacists actually had supervised consumption provision, that often it wasn't used. And that in some ways that could be almost as bad as just doing it over the counter, because you trot off to the room and everybody knows where you've gone, and then you come out the room and everybody's looking at you. So that actually the facilities could not necessarily be used because of the stigma that was attached to the facilities themselves, but just generally the idea of having to consume within the pharmacy was an issue. And also there's this feeling about this taking away the self-control, which it really is at odds to the current idea about getting people to reintegrate better. Well, taking away the self-control over their medication, and it doesn't really fit with an overarching idea that we have within the health service at the moment about giving people more control over their medication. It doesn't seem to apply in this case somehow. I think this point about self-control, start to order their own lives rather than being spoon-fed like irresponsible children was a theme that people sort of brought out quite a lot. Drug testing, all of the agencies use drug testing as a way of, well, they just employ it, because I won't say as a way of preventing diversion, because actually generally people felt that drug testing was a waste of time in terms of preventing diversion, because the fact that most of the drug tests used within agencies are not quantifiable, they're just yes, no for specific drugs. So clients could take a tiny bit the day before as long as it's above the threshold, and the clients will know what that threshold is. And they could just come in and then they show that the methadone turns up and they don't have to worry about it, they can divert the rest. One thing that drug testing was felt to be useful for was the ability to detect the use of street drugs. So it was felt to be a good clinical tool, because somebody would come in, if you showed up that there was heroin and crack in their system, you could then take that step forward. And generally negative tests for methadone or positive tests for street drugs resulted in a return to supervision and a review after discussion with the client. The last area really was that we looked at was how people would respond to direct reports of diversion, even though they were very rare. We realised that there was absolutely no guidelines. None of the key workers could tell us about any guidelines that they knew of in terms of, right, if somebody tells you they are diverting methadone, you have to do this, this and this. But in fairness, the workers' discretion showed consistency. They all generally said that it would result in review, a reiteration of the dangers, and a return to supervision. But as you say, that's pretty rare. And they were sort of very cagey about acting on hearsay, so telltale. Okay, so some conclusions then. Practitioners don't have a clear idea about the extent of methadone diversion. Question is whether they ever could, really, because you're essentially asking clients about something that no matter how many reassurances you give them, they will perceive as being a risk to their continued treatment. Practitioners' views on the nature of the market and the reasons for it are similar to those from previous research, although the altruistic element hasn't been emphasised quite as much. And what we found from our client-based work as well is that they really emphasise the altruistic element, and actually the financial element is less emphasised by the clients. Most of the measures to prevent diversion are perceived to be fairly poor in terms of their outcomes. And I think it's important to highlight here as well that actually quite a lot of these practitioners felt that that was okay, that actually it's acceptable that there's a level of diversion, that was sort of in the pursuit of actually better client individual outcomes, some diversion was an acceptable fact of life. The limitations of supervised consumption in terms of its ability to allow clients to move forward were noted, although it was felt that it was the best way to actually cut down on diversion. And I think the real gap is around the role of pharmacists and the ongoing communication of pharmacists, the role of pharmacists in making sure that people are doing what they should do, the setup of pharmacists in terms of the actual physical aspects of the buildings as well. And what we're doing at the moment is a bunch of work around the client aspect to try and see whether there's a tallying up of the two things, where the two things diverge, to see whether actually we've got a knowledge gap within the practitioners around how much this is actually taking place. That's everything.